She was always waiting at the manor gates. One day, the gates stayed empty. A true story. The lane that ran alongside Ashford Manor was narrow and old. Tall hedges grew on both sides, so thick that in summer they blocked the wind entirely. In winter, frost settled on the dark leaves and stayed there for days, untouched, because almost nobody ever walked that lane. Almost nobody, except Margaret Hollis. Everyone in the village called her Meg. She had lived in the small cottage at the far end of the lane since she was 4 years old, when her mother took the position of head housekeeper at the manor and moved them both into the little stone house that came with the job. Meg grew up hearing the sounds of the estate, the creak of the iron gates, the gravel shifting under car tires, the distant echo of the manor's heavy front door opening and closing. These were the sounds of her childhood, and she loved them the way other children loved music or rain. The gates themselves were something magnificent. They were made of black iron, tall and proud, with the Ashford family crest at the top, 2 stags facing each other, and between them a single oak tree. Meg used to stand at the hedge gap near her cottage and look at those gates when she was small. She liked the way they caught the morning light and threw long shadows across the lane. She liked the way they seemed to hold the world in two, the ordinary world outside, and whatever wonderful world existed on the other side. She was 9 years old the first time she saw Edmund Ashford. He arrived in the back of a large dark car, home from his boarding school at the start of summer. The gates were opened by old Thomas, the groundskeeper, who pulled them wide and touched his cap as the car rolled through. Meg watched from her usual spot near the hedge. Edmund was looking out of the window as the car passed, and for 1 second, his eyes landed on her. He raised his hand in a small wave. She did not wave back. She was so surprised, so completely unprepared for being seen, that she simply stood there, her hand at her side, and watched the car move up the gravel path toward the great house. By the time she thought to raise her own hand, the car had already gone. She thought about that missed wave for a long time afterward. Longer, honestly, than a 9-year-old child had any reason to. The years moved the way years do in the countryside, slowly when you were inside them, and very quickly when you looked back. Meg grew from a quiet child into a quiet young woman. She helped her mother with the estate, learned the names of every plant in the garden, polished the silver in the manor's dining room until she could see her own face in the spoons, and walked the lane every morning before breakfast. Edmund came home each summer and disappeared again each autumn. He went to university somewhere far north, and then there were trips abroad, and then a period in London that seemed to stretch on and on. Meg heard news of him through her mother, who heard it from the housekeeper's network, that quiet system of information that moves through old estates like water through stone. He had been seen in Edinburgh. He had been to France. He had married a woman named Clara, a journalist from London with short hair and very bright eyes. Meg heard that last piece of news on a Tuesday morning while she was hanging sheets in the cottage garden. She finished hanging every single sheet before she went inside. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table and held the cup for a long time without drinking it. Then she got up, washed the cup, and went back to work. That was who Meg was. She did not fall apart. She did not make declarations or changes or decisions that would have made for a more dramatic story. She simply continued. She walked the lane. She tended the grounds. She stood near the gate some mornings, not waiting for anything in particular, or so she told herself, simply enjoying the way the light moved through the iron bars in the early hours, golden and slow. The village talked, of course. Villages always do. The older women said Meg Hollis was a devoted soul. The younger ones said she was wasting her life. 1 or 2 people, over the years, tried to introduce her to this man or that one, a teacher from the next town, a farmer's son, a kind widower who came to church every Sunday. Meg was always polite. She always had a reason why it would not work. And after a while, people stopped trying. Her mother asked her once, very gently, whether she was happy. Meg thought about it seriously before answering. "I am content," she said. "That is not the same thing. But I think it might be enough." Her mother looked at her for a long moment and then said nothing more about it. She understood her daughter better than her daughter knew. Clara, Edmund's wife, left him in 1985. Meg heard this also on a Tuesday. She noticed later that most of the important information in her life arrived on Tuesdays, as if the week needed a day to carry hard things. The marriage had lasted 6 years and produced no children. No one in the village knew quite what had happened, and no one asked directly, because people in that part of England felt very strongly that some questions were not theirs to ask. Edmund came home that autumn for the first time in 2 years. Meg saw the car from the lane. She watched the gates open and close. She walked home and made supper. She did not go looking for a reason to speak to him. But 3 days later, he found her in the walled garden, where she was cutting back the rose bushes for winter. He came around the corner of the old stone wall with his hands in his coat pockets and his collar turned up against the cold, and he stopped when he saw her. "Meg," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. She had always called him that, even though they were nearly the same age. It was easier. It kept things clear. He stood there for a moment, looking at the garden with its bare beds and stripped roses and the thin gray sky above. Then he said, "It looks well kept." "Your father likes it tidy before the frost," she said. He nodded. He seemed like he wanted to say something else, but did not know the shape of it. So he said, "Thank you, Meg," and walked back toward the house. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the roses and continued cutting. The 1990s brought changes to Ashford Manor the way time brings changes to everything, quietly at first, then all at once. Edmund's father grew old and slow. The estate began to cost more than it earned. Parts of the outer land were sold. The stable block was converted into a private home for a young family from the city. The old greenhouse fell into disrepair and was eventually taken down. Meg watched all of this with the steady eyes of someone who had loved a place for a very long time. She did not mourn loudly. She simply noted each change the way a person notes the first gray hair, with a small, private acknowledgement that things were moving forward whether she was ready or not. In 1998, Edmund's father passed away in the spring. Edmund came home to manage the estate settlement and stayed for nearly 6 weeks, the longest Meg could remember him being there since childhood. He was 52. She was 48. They had known each other for almost 40 years without ever truly knowing each other at all. One morning he knocked on the cottage door. "I need someone to walk the grounds with me," he said. "To remind me where things are. You know this place better than anyone." They walked for 3 hours. He asked about the old orchard, the position of the property boundary near the eastern field, the history of the wall that ran along the north side of the garden. She answered each question clearly and fully, pointing things out, explaining what had changed and what had stayed the same. She knew every inch of that land. She had loved it her whole life. At some point during the walk, they stopped talking about the estate. She told him about a family of foxes that had lived under the old equipment shed for the past 3 winters. He told her about a time in France when he had gotten lost for an entire day in a city where he could not speak the language, and how it had been one of the most peaceful days of his life. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polite one. He seemed pleased to have caused it. When they arrived back at the manor's front steps, the afternoon had already turned golden and long. He thanked her. She said it was no trouble. She turned to walk back down the lane. She had gone perhaps 20 steps when she heard the gravel shift behind her, and she knew without looking that he had turned to watch her go. She knew it the way you know certain things, not with your eyes, but with something older and less explainable. She did not look back. She kept walking. She has thought about that decision many times since. He wrote to her the following February. A single page, written in his careful, slightly old-fashioned handwriting, mostly about the estate, some paperwork she needed to sign as a witness for a property transfer, some questions about the groundskeeper's schedule. At the bottom, below his signature, he had written, "I hope the foxes are well. Yours, Edmund." Meg read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. She noticed it was a Thursday and not a Tuesday and felt, for no rational reason, slightly relieved. She read it 7 times before she put it down. Then she picked it up and read it 40 more times across the following week, in the evenings, when the cottage was quiet and the lane outside was dark. She wrote back with the signed paperwork and a note about the groundskeeper's schedule. She answered his questions fully. At the bottom, she wrote, "The foxes had 4 young ones in March. They are doing very well." She signed it, Margaret Hollis. She looked at her signature for a long time. Then she looked at how he had signed his letter. Then she put the envelope down and went to make supper. She posted it the next morning without changing anything. Her mother passed away in 2004. It was peaceful. She went to sleep one November night and simply did not wake up, which Meg felt was the most dignified possible exit for a woman who had lived with such quiet strength. Meg inherited the cottage. She stayed. Of course she stayed. The estate changed hands in a legal sense, though Edmund held on to the manor house itself and a small parcel of the original grounds. He visited less frequently now, once a year, sometimes less. Meg learned to read the season by whether the gates were open or closed. Open meant he was there. Closed meant the world was ordinary. Most years, the gates were closed. She still walked the lane every morning. She had done it for so long now that it was no longer a choice, it was simply part of who she was, like her name or the color of her eyes. She told herself she was walking for the fresh air, for the exercise, for the peace of it. These things were all true. They were also all incomplete. He came back in the summer of 2019. Meg saw the car from her cottage window, the same familiar shape moving slowly up the lane, the gates opening at its approach. He was 73 now, and he walked with a stick, and his hair had gone fully white, but he moved with the same quiet deliberateness she had always associated with him. He knocked on her cottage door the second morning. They walked together every day for the 3 weeks he was there. Not because the estate needed managing, most of that was handled remotely now, but simply because they wanted to. They walked slowly, because of his stick and because there was no reason to rush, and they talked the way people talk when they have finally run out of reasons to avoid the truth. He told her that he had been lonely for most of his adult life. Not unhappy, he was careful to say, he had done interesting things and met interesting people and had a great deal to be grateful for. But underneath all of it, there had been a particular kind of quiet that he had never been able to fill. She told him that she understood that feeling very well. He asked her once, on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky was very blue and the old orchard was heavy with late fruit, whether she had ever regretted staying. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything. No, she said. I never regretted staying. I sometimes wondered what leaving would have felt like. But wondering is not the same as regretting. He nodded slowly. They walked a little further in silence. I think I made a great mistake, Meg, he said. In my life. A very great one. She looked at the ground for a moment. Then she looked up at him. I think we both did, she said. But I am not sure mistakes made from fear rather than cruelty deserve quite so much weight. He stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and unguarded that she found almost difficult to meet. You are a remarkable person, he said. You are only just noticing, she said. He laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that takes a person by surprise. She felt it land somewhere deep in her chest and stay there. On his last evening, they sat on the old wooden bench beside the manor gates and watched the sun go down behind the western field. The sky turned the color of warm stone and then of copper and then of something darker and more tender. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When the car came, his driver, quietly arriving at the appointed hour, he stood slowly and straightened his coat. He took her hand. He held it for a moment, and she felt his thumb move once, gently, across her knuckles. I will come back in the spring, he said. I will be here, she said. She watched the car move down the lane. She watched the gates close behind it. She sat back down on the bench for a little while, even though the air had gone cold, and she looked at the closed gates as the last of the light disappeared from the sky. Then she went home and made supper. The spring of 2020 came cold and wet. The lane was full of puddles. The hedges were just beginning to show their new green growth. A letter arrived at the cottage on a Thursday morning in April. It was from a firm of solicitors in London, formal, careful, correct. It informed her that Mr. Edmund James Ashford had passed away peacefully at his London residence on the 14th of February. The estate matters were being handled. They were writing to all associated parties as a matter of record. Meg sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and read it twice. Then she put on her coat and walked to the gates. They were closed and locked. The manor behind them looked exactly as it always had, solid and permanent and faintly golden in the weak morning light. The iron bars were cold when she put her hand against them. The Ashford crest at the top, the two stags and the oak tree, looked down at her as it always had, patient and unchanging. She stood there for a long time. A car passed on the main road at the far end of the lane. A bird called from somewhere inside the estate. The puddles in the lane reflected the pale sky. She did not cry there. She was a private person in the deepest sense, and grief, for her, was something that happened indoors. She walked home. She put the kettle on. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the solicitor's letter, below all the formal language and the careful legal phrases, there was a postscript. It was not from the solicitors. It was in a different handwriting, slightly unsteady, as if written with effort, but unmistakably his. 7 words, added in blue ink at the bottom of the page. The gates were always yours, Meg. Edmund. She sat down. The kettle boiled. She did not get up to pour it. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and she read those 7 words many times. Outside, the lane was quiet. The morning moved slowly around the cottage, the light shifting, the puddles shining, the new green hedges dripping with the night's rain. She cried then, properly and fully, in the way she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time. She cried for him, and she cried for herself, and she cried for all the mornings she had walked that lane and all the evenings she had sat on that bench and all the moments when the truth had stood right beside her and she had been too careful, too quiet, too afraid to simply reach out and take it. But she also cried because of something else, something that sat alongside the sadness and was not sadness at all. He had known. All those years, all those seasons, all those closed gates and open ones, he had known she was there. He had seen her. And in the end, at the very last possible moment, he had said so. It was not everything. It was not what she would have chosen, or what either of them deserved. But it was something real, and it was true, and in a life built largely on things that were unspoken, it meant more than she could say. She still walks the lane every morning. The gates are permanently closed now. The estate is in the hands of a property company, and there are plans to convert the manor into something or other. She has not asked the details. The iron gates will likely come down in time. The 2 stags and the oak tree will go somewhere, or nowhere. But every morning, just before the rest of the village wakes up, Meg Hollis puts on her coat and walks the lane. She walks slowly, because she is 69 now and there is no reason to rush. The hedges are tall on both sides. In summer they block the wind. In winter the frost settles on the dark leaves and stays for days. She stops at the gates. She puts her hand on the iron bars, as she has done every morning since that April day, and she looks through them at the old gravel path and the silent house beyond. The crest above the gate, the 2 stags, the oak tree, looks back at her. She stands there for a moment. Not waiting, exactly. Not anymore. Just remembering. Just being present in a place that holds more of her life than any other place ever will. Just being, in the quiet way she has always been, a woman who understood that love does not require a particular ending to have been completely real. Then she turns and walks home. The lane is hers. The morning is hers. And somewhere, in 7 words written in unsteady blue ink on a solicitor's letter that she keeps in the top drawer of her kitchen dresser, the gates are hers too. She makes her tea. She sits at the table. She watches the lane through the window. She is content. And some mornings, on the good ones, she thinks that might be more than enough. End.